Paul, you wrote a great piece in The Guardian about the scale of the economic crisis that faces Britain post-Brexit. Can you briefly re-articulate those arguments and try and make clear just how profound a crisis Britain now faces?
Well, since 2008, when Lehman Brothers went bust, I've been predicting that if you stick to a broken economic model, sooner or later, globalization is going to fly apart. I don't want that to happen, but I think Brexit is one of the first cracks in globalization. Basically, people say, look, my circumstances are terrible, my life chances look terrible, and they associate that with the idea of a treaty that links together the economies of several countries, and they go, enough treaty. That's what leaving the EU will be for Britain, so I think it's a really big knock to globalization. That's problem number one. Because if globalization falls apart, then the world economy will sink into stagnation, as it did in the 1930s. And then you look at Britain, basically the right, I think, conned people into voting for something that, under other circumstances, might have been quite a rational thing to do. You leave the EU without a plan. You leave the EU without a plan, it creates a crisis. The IMF's saying, unless we get a plan, we could see up to 5% of GDP fall away. Why have they done that? Because what the right loves is a crisis. Remember that Naomi Klein book, the shock doctrine? They want a shock, and then they can step in and say, we have the answer. And the answer always is the same thing. More neoliberalism, more wage cuts, less trade union laws, more precarious work. That's what's coming down the line if we let the right control the Brexit process.
But in the short term, what kind of economic consequences could we see? Because at the moment it all seems very abstract. Article 50 is yet to be triggered. Yeah. What can it mean in terms of house prices, unemployment, in terms of people's living standards?
Well, already you're seeing global firms step back and say we're not going to invest. As well, a lot of the UK's high-tech economy is based around university science, and the EU is already pulling money out of really major multi-billion projects that British universities were supposed to be part of. So by the end of this year, we'll see less jobs, less job creation. We're probably going to see in the figures an actual fallback in GDP. Now, if you had a government that said, well, we know what we're doing, we have a new model for how Britain's going to look outside the EU. We're going to build export industries. We're going to take people out of precarious shit jobs and put them into really good, well-paying jobs. The damage would be less. What you've got is a government that just doesn't have a plan. And so the extra bit that we as financial journalists always worry about is the financial markets. Because out there in the world are circling people like you see in those films like The Big Short or Wolf of Wall Street, people who only want to use chaos and crisis to enrich themselves. And if they see a target in Britain, they will literally be like sharks around a dead whale. They'll just bite chunks off us. And you can't predict how that comes, but it is literally, it's the fall away of sterling. It is can Britain go on borrowing and what happens to its debt. But don't expect these things to pan out by September. Expect them to pan out as they did after the Lehman Brothers crash within about 6 to 9 months.
So you were obviously a very well-known, acclaimed journalist.
I was the future once.
Yeah, just like David Cameron, BBC, then more recently Channel 4.
Yeah.
You recently effectively finished your career with the mainstream media. You're now a freelance journalist. You're a very prominent supporter of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
What's changed?
I'm still writing my column for The Guardian, and I'm still going to be making long and short form video journalism. But what I wanted to do was step away from the rules-based journalism, because those rules really stack against you if you are in any way committed to social justice. If you like the world as it is, okay, if you think Cameron and sort of Nick Clegg are kind of just basically where the world should be, you can sit quite happily inside these media organisations because the rules are there and you never push against them. But if you want to do social justice journalism, if you want to do journalism that exposes war, torture, war crimes, I reported from Gaza on what I consider to be war crimes, what you're up against is justifiable pressure from your bosses because they have to work within rules. I've kind of done 16 years of working within those rules, and I thought I'd had enough of it and I wanted to do different kind of journalism. I reject the idea that I'm leaving the mainstream. I'm just leaving the regulated mainstream. And I think within The Guardian and the other stuff you'll see me do, I want to try and carry on templating the kind of journalism that can be done. I think what our rules-based journalism combined with the dominance of the kind of neoliberal right in journalism, and this kind of Oxbridge PPE filter that goes through everybody who gets a decent job, what that means is we do very, very unadventurous journalism. It's all within the same kind of template, and I want to break the template.
So for a young person, a young woman or man who's passionate about social justice, wants to help make a better Britain, a better world, would you tell them not to join the BBC?
No, I'd say join the BBC. But, you know, it's like you can only take so much of the percentages game that all journalism is. You know, in that film, I don't know if your viewers have seen it, Ed Murrow, Good Night and Good Luck, the first ever investigative journalism on screen in America. He says in the movie, you know, when he does one good story, do you know how many shit stories I've now got to do to make up for the fact that I did one that caused, you know, an uproar? So if you're going to go into mainstream journalism, especially in this regulated sector, take your principles with you and insist on them. And you'll know you're doing right if every day or every week feels bruised, gritty, strained, stressful, because that's what it should feel like. And actually, you know what? The best of the objective mainstream journalists who've got no agenda, just an agenda of, you know, humanity and democracy and human rights, that's how they feel every day. They'll tell you they spend most of their nights throwing beer cans at the TV screen when they see how crap the output of the kind of the mediocre ones is. So I would really urge people to go into all kinds of mainstream journalism, but at the same time we have to recognise that we have our own ability to create. You're doing it now through these cameras, through the internet. We have our own ability to get straight to the viewer or listener, and that's the future probably.
So we're 9 months into the Jeremy Corbyn project now. He was elected last September. Not quite a year. He's faced obviously incredible challenges both within and outside of his party. What's Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, what have they got right and what have they got wrong?
Well, the ultimate thing that Corbyn got right was understanding that you could break the political mould, that you could step into the Labour Party and actually say, you know, we're going to do things differently. We're going to reject neoliberalism. We're going to reject the Punch and Judy show, the two-party politics, where we're all in it together really, but we just have two different emphases. That's what they got right. And above all, through John McDonnell, what Corbyn got right is that you can break with austerity. I mean, only Labour in the entire social democratic family in Europe has broken with austerity. It's done, in other words, the same kind of economics that Podemos in Spain wants to do, that Syriza in Greece started out doing. Now, that's what they did right. What they did, I don't think wrong, what they did too slowly, was they didn't revolutionise the party fast enough. So they never controlled the HQ. The HQ, over this NEC vote that we've just had, tried to suppress them. And also, though masses of people have flooded into the party, its structures are still the same. And about 6 months ago, I was starting to hear people going, you know, but why do I want to go to a constituency Labour Party meeting where they only discuss, you know, the bin collections? And I can't do anything about the bins being collected 2 weekly or 4 weekly or whatever. And so I have to sit there and listen. I think the next phase is we transform the party into a social movement. And we say to the right-wingers who planned this coup and this plot, as General Sherman did in the American Civil War, if you have chosen war as the means to settle this, we can give you all the war you want. In other words, we can give you much more than you planned for. We can give you a party that comes out of this, not with the status quo. We can struggle to make this party what it should be. A movement that expresses the counterpower of the ordinary people crapped upon by capitalism, and empowers them to come in to the meetings in the same way, for example, as the Occupy movements and the Indignados movements did in 2011, and so that we're then seeing not hundreds but thousands of people involved in political debate. I think, thanks to this coup, this is now possible.
Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen several dozen resignations from the shadow cabinet, 172 MPs, members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, voting to pass a motion of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. How can Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, the 20 to 30 MPs around them, the anti-austerity leadership of the Labour Party right now, how can they continue with this project when they've had such a huge amount of expressed dissent from the Parliamentary Labour Party?
Well, this is like saying 170 people have a greater say than 500,000. If you think about the logic of it, they're saying to the rest of the members, whatever you say, no matter how much you want Corbyn to be leader, because we will never obey him, it is impossible for him to lead the party into the election, and therefore he's unelectable. So we have to just dissect that a bit. I think there's only about 30 hardline Blairites, and I've said before, I actually respect them. They have a philosophy and an ethos that makes sense, although I don't agree with it. What would make sense for them is to leave Labour. And if you read the way that some of them sent the resignation letters, really profoundly insulting. They were burning their bridges. They were basically, it was like a twilight of the gods for them. That's it. They're checked out of the Labour motel, effectively. Good. But for the centre-left, the people who will vote for Angela Regal or Owen Smith or anybody else who comes forward, I think what people like me have to do is convince them. And I've said this like 6 months ago. Corbyn cannot and will not create a pure Corbyn momentum style Labour Party, and should not. Labour has to be an alliance of the centre left, the radical left, and as many of the sort of liberal middle class, sort of middle of the road people who recognise we need a Labour Party. That's what it always has been. And to achieve this, I think we have to say to those centre-left MPs, you have a place, you have ownership of some of the policy, and you have, you should be in the shadow cabinet and you should be in the leadership. That's all we can say to them. Ultimately, you can only do as much as possible, and having done that, if then they come back, Corbyn wins the conference, Corbyn wins the leadership, the NEC has gone left wing, they come back and say, well, we're still not playing. Well, at that point, you would have to then begin a strategic filtering of that PLP. You'd have to take them, maybe 10 or 20 at a time and say, come on, right, we are going to replace you. And I think, I don't favour a mass replacement of them, but I think those who really are going to set out to destroy the party by refusing to accept the leadership result again, at that point you have to say, look, you've probably got better things to do with your life than sit here trying to sabotage the Labour Party, and we have a world to win.
It looks like Corbyn couldn't overcome the obstacles put in front of him from the Parliamentary Labour Party. He has so far. It looks increasingly probable he will remain leader. He'll win this second leadership election. But then, of course, the critics will come back. Well, he can't win a general election. Labour is an anti-austerity party. Under him, can never win a general election. They will not be able to beat the Tories. What would you say to those critics? Right.
Well, we're meant to be living in an era characterised by that famous sociology book, Bowling Alone. There's no association, there's no solidarity, there's no friendship. We're all isolated. And yet, in this era, Labour has managed to recruit 500,000 people in a country of 60 million. That's not nothing. My hunch is that if we can turn those, even a tenth of those 500,000 people into activists in a smart way, they will, through their face-to-face connections, in the kind of bus queues, in the kind of Facebook friendship groups, in the general pub life of Britain, have a massive impact and begin to draw people to a project. And the project can't be Jeremy Corbyn. I actually don't care about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, he's a nice guy and he's the right person to lead Labour, but all he is for me is a placeholder to create a social movement where people themselves begin to transform the society around them and their own lives and their own life's chances. This is what the Labour movement did for generations of working class people. It dragged them from ignorance to power. I mean, power in their own selves. And I think that's what I want to do. And once we do that, winning the election's a byproduct.
But then somebody would come back to you, even somebody like an Owen Jones, even people on the left will say, but look, his approval ratings are so bad, we've never seen anything like it, even though Labour are actually polling pretty well in certain opinion polls, one out today, showing them just 1 point behind the Tories, despite the chicken coup. What would you say to them? I mean, are the polls wrong? Is this going to be a total break with every kind of election we've seen since the Second World War? How's it going to pan out?
I actually think Alistair Campbell said something in a big discussion they had with some Cold War think tank straight after the Brexit vote. He said, you'd be surprised which of the Labour contenders comes forward, and as they go through history, they'll become leader-like. I actually think this is happening to Corbyn, weirdly enough. It's happening to Corbyn quicker than it's happened to any of the so-called challengers to Corbyn. But in the end, I don't want Labour to replace a kind of Gordon Brown style sort of martinet or a Tony Blair style sort of autocrat with a left-wing autocrat. Actually, because I know the history of the left, I think the left-wing autocrat will be even worse than both of them in terms of party style and management. Corbyn, I've said this, Corbyn is like sort of Gandalf, whereas what people are used to is kind of Aragorn, aren't they? He's more of a sort of lead by enabling. But what they say in business, it's business speak, but it's true. A good leader in that style, what do? They create other leaders. Now, I think we're only at the beginning of this, because Corbyn tried to create other leaders by getting all kinds of young MPs into the shadow cabinet who said they were quite left-wing. And I know for a fact that inside that shadow cabinet, the big problem, many of these people, most of them now left, was competency, was actually delivering what you need to do. So Corbyn tried, he's going to have to try again. He's going to have to try again with a new bunch of left-wing and centre-left people and pull them into the shadow cabinet and enable them with some of the best people around, the activists who are part of this movement now, and get them up to speed to prepare for government. And that means running the NHS. It means scrapping the market in the NHS. It means running the cops and doing what Sadiq Khan did, sell the water cannon, sell the riot squad. Slim it down. Think about all kinds of things we want to do to the state, to the public services, to democracy itself. We've got the activists. We just need to sharpen the movement into a bunch of people who are prepared to take hold of ministries and do what Syriza tried to do, transform society.
So let's say there's a general election next year, year after, whenever, even 2020. It's clear that even if all the things you're saying come good, Labour form a government, either a majority or a minority or a coalition government, Corbyn is the Prime Minister, the variables at work, potential economic stagnation, very weak pound, what you refer to as stagflation, perhaps increased unemployment, underemployment, falling foreign direct investment, surely a socialist Prime Minister would mean an even greater run on the pound, even less foreign direct investment, even more risk for the very markets you've said are circling us right now. So what can Corbyn do, or is that not inevitable?
I don't even call myself a socialist. I call myself a post-capitalist. I have a different view about what the future of humanity is beyond capitalism. And I think it's about sharing, I think it's about cooperation, I think it's about the production of free stuff for free. And what is good about that is that you can slot that in, actually, behind quite a bit of traditional labour economics. You can say, let's cut the working week, right, with no loss of pay. Let's then enable people to do things voluntarily in their own communities that produces stuff and produces services. So, for example, buddying with elderly people trapped at home, for free, not paid for by social services. The for free element of the transformative economics that I believe in I think, can be almost like a get out of jail card for a left-wing government that's pressured by markets. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is to be radical in fiscal and monetary policy. And I think that when I speak to Corbyn, McDonnell and people who surround them, that's what I say all the time. That's what I said at their economics conference. Fiscal radicalism isn't going to be such a problem now, because even the Tories are saying we're going to need a fiscal stimulus. So 100 billion, Sajid Javid says. All we need to do is to put the 100 billion in one spreadsheet column and add up what we want to use that 100 billion for, because they've given us permission to do that. We could do more. Where's the money going to come from? I think some of it will have to come from taxing the rich. We don't know how big the tax gap is that we could collect, but I think a lot of the money for the stimulus comes from monetary policy. And this is not something that Labour people are very au fait with. We have to take control of the Bank of England, prevent...
So you're saying nationalisation of the Bank of England,
well,
or it would come under political control?
Yeah, it is already under political control.
But it's meant to be, it's nominally independent, isn't it?
Yeah, but the nominal independence in most other countries has already gone to shit, basically. Look at the Bank of Japan, it's more or less controlled by the government. We have to do radical monetary stimulus And that means printing money and then using it for unorthodox means that immediately benefit people. And one of the things I've thrown out, it's one thing you could do, is you could print 70 billion, they've printed 375 already, print another 70, buy every student loan that's still outstanding, bury them for 30 years, cancel the repayments for 30 years for free. No, the pound will take a hit, and we are going to have to come up with solutions on falling pound. But at the same time, over a longer period, you want to develop exports. And actually, the 1930s, when Britain last stepped away from the global system, after it came off the gold standard in 1931, show you how quickly, if you reprioritise investment, you can actually stimulate the economy. The Baldwin government, Tory government in the mid-30s, if you wander through the suburban England, all you see is houses built then, because they were able to accommodate people by houses, roads, Art Deco, masterpiece, architecture, build stuff. You can do that.
With the SNP, with the rise of the SNP since 2010, with the referendum on independence in Scotland being so close in the last couple of weeks, with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, now more recently with Britain voting to leave the EU, each time the mainstream media failed to call it, at least the majority of informed mainstream media opinion. Why does the British mainstream media keep on getting these big calls wrong over the last couple of years? And do you think that can change?
I think the media all over the world is trapped in an echo chamber, and what people don't realise, because they've studied in these highly structured, kind of degrees that are meant to be high quality, but in actual fact teach people to think inside boxes. They don't see that the masses have re-entered history, and the masses this time are not just these serried ranks of kind of hierarchically organised, communists or social democrats or fascists. They are educated people, 3 billion extra educated brains added to humanity in my lifetime, and they have the means to communicate. And they keep doing things that surprise people who think inside the box of hierarchy and authority. Now, if you look specifically at this coup right now, what you're seeing in the media is a complete failure to understand why people are angry. They misinterpret the anger of people about the coup for thuggishness or hatred. Okay, but anger is a justified response. If you are, as many people in the Labour movement are, decades-long activists in a 200-year-old movement that has faced a constant struggle for its own autonomy from those in power and those with wealth. And if you see, effectively, representatives of the 1% try to reach inside your party and switch off an elected leader, elected by 250,000 people, by diktat, you get angry. And the reason why the media doesn't understand that is because none of them live that life. They're not loyal. They haven't grown up in a world of the classic Labourism, nor are they, and many of them not allowed to, take part in activism. So they have no experience of what it is to chain yourself to the gate of a small airport, be dragged away, protest on the most sort of pacifist way, and then get sprayed with tear gas. They don't live that, and therefore they don't understand where the anger comes from. You can see it the way they looked at Black Lives Matter. Why are they so angry? Why don't they just do it in the old way like Martin Luther King? Well, try it. So I think that the media's lack of understanding of where the wellspring of anger and discontent in society is not excusable, actually, because even somebody as old, to be frank, as say Ken Loach, who spent his entire life in this kind of in this hierarchical labour movement that I come from as well. Loach's movies, he knocks them out one by one by one. They always get to the root of the anger and discontent. So why shouldn't our 5-minute and 2.5-minute filmmakers, who we pay with effectively publicly funded BBC, why shouldn't they be able to get on top of that? Many people from that old generation, who ITV, BBC, etc., the documentary makers, despair at young journalists in the mainstream ability to connect with where the anger is coming from. And I would, having done that job, I know how hard it is, but I think, my goodness, just wake up to the anger that's surrounding us.
So one of the major lines between you, Jeremy Corbyn, the relevant members of the Shadow Cabinet, and the movement behind him is on nuclear weapons. Earlier this year, you wrote a piece for The Guardian, and you also did a short video outlining how you would reduce Britain's conventional armed forces, but maintain a nuclear deterrent. Can you go into that in a little bit more detail? Because for a lot of Corbyn's supporters, this is a red line. This is one of the major issues which have defined his parliamentary career.
Well, let me say, first of all, for me, it's not a red line. I'm quite happy to be in a party that adopts unilateral disarmament as its policy. It's just I don't have that policy. My position is often described by military thinkers as nuclear Switzerland. So you have an army of volunteers, an army that is defensive, but you have nukes as a kind of insurance policy. I would call it nuclear Switzerland plus a navy, because you need a navy to have our kind of nuclear deterrent. I think that I would keep Trident, first and foremost, because we're in a world where of the 5 nuclear powers, 2 are crazy dictatorships, China and Russia. 1 is America, an unhinged imperialist country could soon have Donald Trump in charge, and France has got Marine Le Pen. So what I want to do is get all of them to give up their nuclear weapons. And to do that, I think we need to be at that table. Now, that's not a classic far left position, but it's my position. To pay for keeping some form of nuclear weapons, you have to make choices. I'm not a big fan of expeditionary warfare. It always goes wrong, it always destroys and leaves chaos behind wherever you invade, and we're a power on our own anyway. We can't afford it. So I would cut very radically Britain's expeditionary war, the invasion force that the Tories have decided to build, and the Bahrain naval base that they've decided. I'll cut all that, right? Now, what kind of nukes is the question. The Tories are trying to impose on Labour CASD, Continuous At-Sea Deterrence, and Labour are going to be asked to vote for it. I would vote against it, right? Because I can say this: you build the Trident submarines, the successor class submarines as they're called, in Barrow, but you can then choose to do different things with them. You can make the policy of how you use the Trident missiles subject to a political review that goes on every 2 or 3 years, and you can say, look, if tensions in the world are less, we don't put them to sea all the time. If tensions in the world are rising, we can put all of them to sea and announce where they're targeting. You can do a lot of things that the Brits have traditionally not done, but Obama in 2010, when he came into power, decided to write stuff down about how you're going to use these nuclear weapons. Then there's the question of the post-Brexit situation. Even some on the right in British politics are saying post-Brexit we might have to rethink even more about nuclear weapons, because the other option is, and I think the Labour review did consider this, is to take the Astute class submarines. These are submarines that attack other submarines that we're already building, build more of them. They can carry cruise missiles, and you just forget the Trident intercontinental ballistic missile that goes like that, and you just use the cruise missile that goes like this, and it's less. It's definitely a less of a deterrent, but that might be all we can afford. So look, I'm in the sphere of practical politics here on defence, because I've seen how Syriza in Greece solved it. Syriza said, we're not going to leave NATO, right? We're going to defend ourselves through NATO. We need NATO. Forget leaving NATO. And it gave them permission to do the main attack, which is the attack on the oligarchy and what they tried to do, left-wing economics. I think Corbyn is going to have to do that. You're going to have to say, do one battle and one battle alone in the first term anyway, and that is you fight for social justice and radical economics, and you don't try and take on the military industrial complex at the same time.
Another line which you've crossed, which is seemingly at odds with many people behind Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, is on freedom of movement. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's just a description of what's happening. We're leaving the EU. The referendum clearly expressed that would also mean effectively not being in the EEA or EFTA, so we can't just have freedom of movement. So are you just describing, is it just an observation, or do you think that we should cut freedom of movement? Because there's a lot of people watching this that will vote for Jeremy Corbyn in the next leadership election who disagree with that point.
Okay, so first of all, let's look at the practicalities. I want Britain to apply to join to the European Economic Area, the EEA, and to make that application, you're going to have to accept the 4 freedoms, and one of them is freedom of movement. Now, however, inside the EEA, you get something you don't get inside the EU, which is the ability to put an emergency brake on freedom of movement. Okay, that's the position. It's not my position, it is the position. Because I think without EEA, the economy is going to slide. There's a big difference in prognosis inside or outside the European single market. Now, the next problem we have is that consent for freedom of movement was severely eroded. And if you look at the graph, it's really obvious what did it. Places with high migrant populations, a lot of them voted to stay in. But places with high recent migrant populations, more or less correlate along a 45-degree line of voting out. So we have to restore, this is what we have to do, we have to restore consent for inward migration. We have to restore consent, if we can, for freedom of movement. The first way you do that is by attacking the microeconomics of the slave labour systems and the migrant-only workforces and the polytunnels where you can't join a union, you can't go to the toilet. Attack that first and see if people will then accept freedom of movement. At the same time, you could, by negotiation only, and this is what I'm talking about, by negotiation with your European partners say, since it's caused us so much trouble, since there is so much lack of consent in our country for it, can you give us a breathing space? Could we, for example, put a high level target on the amount of inward migration from Europe that we're expecting? But if we even breach that high level target, because, for example, the European Union collapses, could we agree that we, the Brits, could temporarily apply the emergency brake? That's what I would be asking inside Europe if I could, because I do want to try and restore consent for migration. And you don't do it by pandering to racism, you do it by saying we have an answer to the problem you're really worried about, which is the collapse of low-end working class wages. And the answer is change the labour market rules and, if necessary, temporarily put the brake on.
Well, John McDonnell told me something very similar. He said that the solution here is something along the line, I would say, of probably closed shop unions. I think he was kind of implying...
I want a closed shop. Closed shop would be fantastic. Unions recruiting the workforce, problem solved.
But then some would respond to what you're saying and they would say, but even having this on the menu as a potential solution is misleading, it's misguiding, because I think you would say this, I would certainly say this, that the problems of low-paid Britain aren't caused by migration, they're caused by the kind of capitalism the world currently has, globalised neoliberal capitalism, and the kind of changes we've seen in the labour market, labour laws, union laws in this country over the last couple of decades. So to even have that as an option is to allow a misguided, fundamentally incorrect assertion to live on.
Well, you see, and yet we do nothing about the fact that migration from outside the European Union is heavily controlled. It's completely controlled by a points system. People associate the points system with Nigel Farage. It's the government policy.
Theresa May.
Yeah, it's the British government's actual policy that actually exists now, and it means that if you're a mathematician from India or you're from Latin America and you're a ballet dancer, you find it really difficult to get into the UK. I would like to free things up for them more. And yet, the left seems to have no problem. It doesn't go on the streets marching against this point system. It seems to obsess about the EU thing. The freedom of movement is a principle of the European Union. It isn't a principle of the left. The left's principle is open borders, which is a different principle. Now, that's my principle as well. Open borders in the future when we can achieve it. But if you think about this, capital can move wherever it wants in the world. Labour within Europe can move wherever it wants. What's the result? Capital moves to Hungary, so the German car factories move to Hungary to exploit cheap labour. People then are, expelled from these poor countries. They come to the place where there are the most cheap, crappy jobs, which is Britain, set itself up as the cheap job capital of the world. And is that social justice? What you need is a Europe-wide labour policy. I would set up a Europe-wide labour ministry that says these are where the jobs are going to be, these are where the jobs are now, let's move them around, let's raise the minimum wage, let's unify the minimum wage. The only problem is I can't do that anymore because lack of consent for migration caused 52%, I would argue, of British people, mainly that's what drove it, to leave Europe. So we have just a new situation, and we have to apply the principles of internationalism and anti-racism in the new situation.
Paul, thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Cheers.